It's 1985, and America has two undisputed heavyweight champions of urban living, New York City and Chicago. Ask someone from New York which city is better, and they'll laugh at you for even asking the question. Ask someone from Chicago, and they'll give you 10 reasons why their city beats New York without breaking a sweat. This wasn't just friendly rivalry. This was serious business. These two cities represented different versions of the American dream, different ways of living, different philosophies about what makes a city great. And if you lived through the 1980s in either place, you had opinions. Strong opinions. Let's start with the most obvious difference: the price of living like a human being. In 1985, a decent one-bedroom apartment in Manhattan would cost you around $800 to $1,000 a month. And that's if you were willing to live in a building where the heat worked maybe 60% of the time, and your neighbors included at least one person who seemed like they might be running a criminal enterprise. In Chicago, that same $1,000 got you a spacious two-bedroom apartment in a nice neighborhood like Lincoln Park or Lakeview, with actual closet space, working appliances, and a landlord who answered the phone. A really nice one-bedroom in a Chicago high-rise with a doorman and a view of the lake? $600. New Yorkers will tell you that you pay more because it's worth more, and maybe they're right. But Chicagoans were living in significantly more space with significantly less financial stress. The cost difference extended to everything. A slice of pizza in New York was $1.25. In Chicago, you could get 2 slices for that price, and they'd be bigger slices. A beer at a neighborhood bar in Manhattan? $3, maybe $4. Same beer in Chicago? $1.50, and the bartender would probably pour you a generous one. Going out to a nice dinner in New York could easily cost you $50 per person before drinks. In Chicago, you could have an exceptional meal at a white tablecloth restaurant for $30, and the portions would be twice the size. New Yorkers accepted these prices as the cost of living in the greatest city in the world. Chicagoans looked at those prices and thought New Yorkers were out of their minds. Transportation was another massive difference. New York had the subway, which ran 24 hours and could theoretically get you anywhere in the city. The problem was that the subway in the 1980s was, and there's no polite way to say this, absolutely terrifying. The cars were covered in graffiti inside and out. The station smelled like a combination of urine, hot garbage, and despair. Crime was rampant. Everyone had a story about something crazy they'd seen on the subway, and if you rode it regularly, you'd witnessed at least 1 or 2 genuinely scary situations. But it was cheap. It was fast when it worked, and it was essential to life in New York. You couldn't really live in New York without using the subway unless you were wealthy enough to take cabs everywhere. Chicago had the L, which was cleaner, safer, and more pleasant to ride. But it didn't go everywhere, and it stopped running at reasonable hours. Most Chicagoans drove. Parking was abundant and cheap compared to New York. You could find street parking in most neighborhoods without circling for an hour. Gas was affordable. Insurance was lower. Having a car in Chicago was normal. Having a car in Manhattan was either a sign that you were rich or that you were an idiot who enjoyed sitting in traffic and paying $300 a month for a parking space. The car versus subway debate perfectly illustrated the fundamental difference between these cities. New York forced you to adapt to its system. Chicago accommodated your choices. Let's talk about the job markets because this is crucial. New York in the 1980s was the center of the financial universe. Wall Street was booming. Investment banking, trading, corporate law, advertising, publishing, fashion, these industries were headquartered in New York, and the money was insane. Young people were moving to New York and making six-figure salaries by their late 20s if they could handle the pressure and the hours. The city attracted the most ambitious, most driven, most talented people from around the world, and it chewed them up and spit them out. But the ones who survived became very wealthy very quickly. New York was where you went if you wanted to be the best, make the most money, and prove you could compete at the highest level. Chicago had a strong economy too, but it was more diversified and more stable. Manufacturing was still significant. The commodity exchanges were massive. Corporate headquarters for major companies like Sears, Motorola, and McDonald's were based in or around Chicago. The legal and financial sectors were robust. You could have an excellent career in Chicago, make good money, work and have a much better quality of life than your counterpart in New York. The trade-off was that the absolute peak earning potential wasn't quite as high. And if you were in certain industries like fashion or publishing, Chicago simply didn't have the same opportunities. But for most professional careers, Chicago offered 90% of the opportunity with 50% of the stress and cost. The cultural scenes were both incredible but completely different in character. New York had Broadway, which was unmatched. The theater scene in the 1980s was phenomenal. You had legendary shows like Cats, Les Miserables, and The Phantom of the Opera. You had off-Broadway productions that were edgy and experimental. You had comedy clubs where Eddie Murphy and Jerry Seinfeld were performing. The art galleries in Soho were showing work that would define a generation. The music scene included everything from punk at CBGB to hip-hop, emerging in the Bronx, to jazz clubs that had been operating since the 1920s. If you wanted to be on the cutting edge of American culture, New York was the only place to be. Chicago's cultural scene was equally rich, but more accessible and less pretentious. The theater scene was amazing, with Steppenwolf Theater producing some of the most important American plays of the decade. Second City was churning out comedy legends like John Belushi, Bill Murray, and Gilda Radner had all come through there. The blues scene was authentic and alive, with clubs on the south and west sides where you could see incredible musicians for the price of a couple of drinks. The Art Institute of Chicago was world-class and free on Thursdays. Chicagoans could participate in high culture without needing to be wealthy or connected. New York's cultural scene felt like it was for insiders and people who could afford it. Chicago's cultural scene felt like it belonged to everyone. Food is where things get really contentious. New Yorkers will tell you their city has the best food in America, and they're not entirely wrong. The diversity was unmatched. You could find authentic cuisine from virtually every country in the world. The Italian food in Little Italy, the Chinese food in Chinatown, the Jewish delis, the Greek diners open 24 hours. The variety was mind-blowing. And the pizza, New York pizza in the 1980s from places that had been operating since the 1950s. Thin crust, perfect sauce, that slight char on the bottom. It was legitimately great. But Chicagoans would argue, correctly, that their food scene was just as good and more honest. Deep dish pizza wasn't just a gimmick, it was a completely different and equally valid form of pizza, and the best examples from Lou Malnati's or Gino's East were transcendent. The hot dogs were better in Chicago, and this isn't even debatable. An authentic Chicago-style hot dog with all the fixings on a poppy seed bun was a work of art. The Italian beef sandwiches had no equivalent in New York. The steakhouses in Chicago were just as good as New York's best, but cost significantly less. And the ethnic food, while perhaps not quite as diverse, was authentic and often better, because the immigrant communities in Chicago were more established and less transient. The lakefront in Chicago was and is one of the greatest urban amenities in America. 26 miles of public beaches and parks right on Lake Michigan, all free, all accessible. In the summer, Chicagoans would spend weekends at the beach, riding bikes on the lakefront path, having picnics in Grant Park. The beaches were clean, well-maintained, and genuinely pleasant places to spend time. New York had beaches too, but getting to them required a significant journey to Coney Island or the Rockaways, and they were crowded and not particularly clean. Manhattan had Central Park, which is magnificent, but Chicago had the entire lakefront plus neighborhood parks throughout the city. For quality of life and outdoor recreation, Chicago won this category decisively. The social dynamics were completely different. New Yorkers in the 1980s were aggressive, fast-talking, and had no patience for anything they perceived as wasting their time. The stereotypical rude New Yorker absolutely existed. People would push past you on the sidewalk without apology. Customer service ranged from indifferent to openly hostile. But New Yorkers would tell you this wasn't rudeness, it was efficiency. Everyone was busy, everyone had somewhere to be, and the social contract in New York was that you didn't slow other people down with unnecessary pleasantries. Once you understood this, and if you could match their energy, New Yorkers could actually be incredibly helpful and surprisingly friendly. Chicagoans were Midwestern friendly, which meant actual friendliness, not just efficiency disguised as friendness. Strangers would chat with you on the L. Bartenders would remember your name. Neighbors would help you shovel snow without being asked. There was a genuine sense of community in Chicago neighborhoods that was harder to find in New York. The flip side was that Chicago could feel provincial compared to New York's international sophistication. Chicagoans were proud of their city, but they didn't have the same level of self-importance that New Yorkers had. Whether you found this refreshing or boring depended entirely on your personality. Weather is worth discussing because it affected daily life significantly. New York winters were cold and unpleasant, but manageable. You'd have snow, ice, gray skies, and bitter winds, but it rarely got truly brutal. Chicago winters were absolutely punishing. The wind coming off Lake Michigan in January would cut through any coat you owned. Temperatures would regularly drop below zero. The city would get buried in snow multiple times per season. But Chicagoans took pride in enduring their winters. It was part of the identity. If you could handle a Chicago winter, you could handle anything. And the payoff was that Chicago summers were absolutely glorious. Warm, but not too hot. Low humidity, perfect for being outdoors. New York summers were miserable, hot, humid, with the added bonus of garbage smells intensifying in the heat and the subway stations feeling like saunas. The sports culture was another major difference. Both cities were passionate about their teams, but in different ways. New York had the Yankees, the Mets, the Giants, the Jets, the Knicks, the Rangers. Multiple teams in every sport, which meant the fan base was divided. Yankees fans hated Mets fans. Giants fans hated Jets fans. There was tribalism within the city itself. Chicago had one team per sport, mostly, and the entire city united behind them. The Bears, the Cubs, the White Sox, the Bulls, the Blackhawks. Being a Cubs fan in Chicago in the 1980s meant suffering through terrible seasons, but doing it together with thousands of other people at Wrigley Field on a sunny afternoon, drinking old style and hoping this would finally be the year, even though you knew it wouldn't be. The architecture and physical beauty of the cities were both spectacular, but in completely different ways. New York had the iconic skyline, the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, the energy of Times Square, the grandeur of Grand Central Terminal. Walking through Manhattan felt like being inside the center of the world. The density, so the height of the buildings, the sheer scale of everything was overwhelming in the best way. Chicago had arguably better architecture from a design perspective. The skyscrapers downtown, many designed by legends like Mies van der Rohe and Louis Sullivan, were more elegant and more innovative. The city was more spacious, more planned, easier to navigate. Chicago felt like a city designed for humans. New York felt like a city that humans had to adapt to. Safety was a real concern in both cities during the 1980s, but New York was significantly more dangerous. The crime rate in New York in the early 1980s was astronomical. Murders, muggings, burglaries, all were common enough that everyone knew someone who'd been a victim of crime. Times Square was full of adult theaters and drug dealers. Entire neighborhoods were effectively no-go zones for anyone who didn't live there. Chicago had crime too, particularly in certain South and West Side neighborhoods, but it was more geographically contained. The downtown and North Side neighborhoods where most young professionals lived were relatively safe. You could walk around at night in most of Chicago without feeling like you were taking your life into your hands. So which city had it better in the 1980s? The honest answer is, it depends entirely on what you valued. If you were young, ambitious, willing to sacrifice comfort and money for opportunity and excitement, if you wanted to be at the absolute center of American culture and finance, if you thrived on intensity and competition, New York was the obvious choice. It was the big leagues, the major stage, and if you could make it there, you really could make it anywhere. The trade-offs were brutal, the cost was absurd, and the city would wear you down, but the rewards were unmatched. If you wanted a high quality of life, if you valued space and affordability, if you wanted to have a great career while also having time and money to enjoy your life, if you appreciated Midwestern friendliness and genuine community, Chicago was clearly better. You could have everything that mattered: career, culture, great food, entertainment, without the constant stress and financial pressure that defined life in New York. You might not reach the absolute peaks of wealth and fame available in New York, but you'd be happier and more comfortable getting to wherever you ended up. The rivalry between these cities in the 1980s wasn't just about which buildings were taller or which pizza was better. It was about two different philosophies of urban living, two different versions of success, two different ways of being American. New York was about ambition, intensity, and proving yourself against the best. Chicago was about balance, community, and building a good life. Both cities offered something genuinely valuable. Both cities were at their peak in different ways. And the fact that we're still arguing about which one was better 40 years later tells you everything you need to know about how special both cities were during that decade.